Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of this Bob Lee case, the Cash Out founder who was killed in San Francisco. I think most people probably remember hearing about this one. It really shook up the tech world and kind of beyond. I mean, it wasn't just the violence itself, but also the fact that both the victim and the suspect were part of that same world.
Yeah, I think you're right. It almost felt like it kind of brought together a lot of anxieties
Yeah,
that people were already feeling about San Francisco at the time.
exactly. It definitely hit a nerve, and that just made the whole trial even more intense. For anyone who hasn't been following super closely, let's just set the scene. April 4th, 2023, Bob Lee's found stabbed to death on a street in Rincon Hill. Now, right away, that's obviously shocking, but it gets even more complicated when we learn that the suspect is Nima Momeni, someone who also had connections to the tech community.
Yeah, and that connection right off the bat made people wonder, was this just random or was there something more going on here?
Mm,
And I think the trial, which remember ended with Nima Momeni being found guilty of second-degree murder,
right.
really tried to get to the bottom of that question.
Second-degree murder, huh? That's interesting. I remember when it happened, a lot of people were asking why not first degree.
Right, well, the difference really comes down to premeditation. The jury in the end decided that while Momeni definitely meant to do it, it wasn't necessarily something he planned out in advance. So basically they saw it as more of a crime of passion in the heat of the moment.
Which honestly just makes it even more complicated. So how did each side present their case? I mean, what led the jury to that verdict?
So the prosecution basically argued that this was revenge, plain and simple. They said that Momeni was angry with Lee for introducing his sister Kazar to a man who had given her GHB. GHB obviously is a really serious drug.
Yeah.
So they're trying to paint a picture of Momeni holding a grudge. And that's what led to the confrontation and ultimately the killing.
So a very personal motive tied to this drug incident. But wait, the defense had a completely different story, right?
Totally. Their claim was self-defense. They said that Lee, who the toxicology report showed, had alcohol, cocaine, A&D, ketamine in his system at the time of his death, became aggressive, and actually lunged at Momeni with a knife. According to them, it all started because of a bad joke, and Momeni was simply protecting himself.
Wow. Okay, that is a huge difference in narrative. So what evidence did they use to back those claims up?
Well, for one thing, the prosecution pointed out that Momeni didn't report the incident to the police at all. They argued that if it was truly self-defense, why not call for help, or at least tell someone what happened? They said that silence raised a lot of red flags.
Yeah, that makes sense. The jury would definitely be thinking about that. But on the other hand, the defense had the toxicology report showing Lee was under the influence of a lot of substances. I mean, wouldn't that support their claim that Lee could have been the aggressor?
It's possible. They really emphasized that Lee's behavior, because of the drugs, could have been erratic, unpredictable, even violent. They used that to make their case that Momeni was just reacting to a real threat.
This is already so complicated, and we haven't even gotten to the family statements or the whole San Francisco context yet. Earlier, you said this case kind of tapped into some existing anxieties about the city. How does that fit in?
Well, after Lee's death, there were a lot of very public arguments about safety in San Francisco. Some people, like Elon Musk, even used the case to make these really broad statements about crime in the city.
Oh, yeah, I remember that whole thing. He called the crime rate horrific, which
Right.
definitely didn't help. Of course, a lot of people pushed back on that right away.
Yeah, the district attorney, Brooke Jenkins, was very firm that this was not a typical case at all. She was urging people not to let outsiders control the narrative about San Francisco's safety.
It became this debate about perception versus reality. Was this just a really awful, isolated incident or a sign of something bigger happening in San Francisco?
Right. And remember, the trial went on for 6 weeks. So it must have been really intense for everyone involved.
It must have been. Were there any particularly powerful moments during the trial?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The family statements were really tough to hear, especially Bob Lee's brother, Oliver. He spoke after the verdict saying he was relieved that Momeni wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. It was a very real reminder of the incredible loss they had suffered.
That's heavy. Did Momeni's family say anything?
Yeah, his mother, Manaz Tairani, she spoke to reporters too. She said that the whole thing was because of drug abuse, and she also claimed her son didn't get a fair trial. She said they would be appealing the verdict. So this story might not be over just yet.
It's just heartbreaking. Two families completely devastated by this one event, each with their own version of what happened. I can't imagine what it was like for the jury to try and make sense of it all.
Yeah, it was definitely a tough job, especially with so much conflicting information and all the emotions surrounding the case. To really understand their decision, we need to take a closer look at some of the evidence and the legal strategies that were used during the trial.
Okay, let's do that. I'm really curious to hear what else stood out to you as we unpack all the details of this case.
Yeah, one thing that really stood out was how both sides used that whole drug use angle. We already talked about the toxicology report, showing Lee had all those substances in his system when he died. That was a huge part of the defense's case.
Yeah, it sounds like they really used that to push the self-defense argument. Did they have any other evidence to support that?
They did, actually.
Yeah.
There were some witnesses who said they had seen Lee acting erratically in the hours before he was killed. They described him as being agitated, confrontational, which the defense used to try and paint him as the aggressor that night.
So basically, they wanted to show a pattern of behavior that would make it more believable that he would attack Momeni. How did the prosecution respond to that? I mean, did they just completely dismiss those witnesses?
Well, they shouldn't completely ignore it, but they did try to question the credibility of some of those people. And they also emphasized that even if Lee was acting out, that didn't automatically justify stabbing him to death. Their point was that Momeni's reaction was way too extreme, even if Lee did start it.
Which brings up a really important point about self-defense legally. I mean, it's not just about who started it, right? It's about whether the force used was reasonable and proportionate to the threat.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really tricky, especially in this case where there were no other eyewitnesses to the actual fight. The jury basically had to piece together what happened based on the evidence they had. Expert testimony, their own understanding of the events, and then decide if Momeni was really defending himself or if he went too far.
Man, that must have been such a tough decision to make. I mean, you said earlier that this whole case seemed to really weigh on both families. We talked about their statements in court, but what about the lasting impacts, beyond the trial itself?
Well, obviously for Bob Lee's family, there's just the immense grief of losing someone so suddenly and violently. But they've also had to deal with all the public attention and speculation surrounding the case. It's like their personal tragedy was turned into this national news story, with everyone commenting and giving their opinions, which I can't imagine how difficult that would be to handle while grieving.
It's almost like their privacy was completely invaded. And what about Momeni's family? What are they going through?
Well, for them, it's a different kind of pain, right? They're dealing with his conviction and the possibility that he'll be in prison for a long time. His mother's statement about appealing the verdict shows they haven't given up, but it's going to be a tough road ahead for them.
Yeah, this whole situation is just so sad. It really makes you think about how these cases aren't just about legal arguments and evidence. There are real people whose lives are forever changed by what happened.
That's so true. And beyond the individuals directly involved, this case also impacted the whole tech community and even San Francisco's reputation in general.
Right. You mentioned earlier that it kind of played into some existing worries about San Francisco. Can you tell me more about that? What was it about this specific case that made people so uneasy?
I think part of it is that San Francisco has always been associated with innovation and wealth, this whole tech-driven lifestyle. But over the past few years, there's also been growing concern about things like income inequality, homelessness and crime. And this case, with these two high-profile figures from the tech world, and the violence of the crime itself, it just kind of brought all those worries to the surface.
It's like it forced people to confront those anxieties head on. Did the case actually lead to any changes in terms of public policy or how people view San Francisco?
That's a tough question to answer. It definitely sparked a lot of debate about these issues. Some people used it as proof that San Francisco was becoming more dangerous, especially for wealthy or successful individuals. They argued that this showed a need for stricter law enforcement and tougher punishments for violent crimes.
And I'm sure others disagreed with that completely.
Yeah, absolutely. They said that just focusing on law enforcement ignores the systemic problems that contribute to crime in the first place, like poverty, mental health issues, lack of access to resources. They pushed for a more holistic approach to community safety, investing in social programs, addressing the root causes of these problems instead of just reacting after the fact.
It sounds like this case became a symbol for much bigger conversations about criminal justice, social inequality, even the role of tech in shaping our cities.
Yeah.
Did those conversations actually lead to any tangible changes, though? Did anything concrete come out of them?
Well, people definitely started talking about these issues in a different way. But whether that translated into actual policy changes or community initiatives is harder to say. Some people say the case brought renewed attention to public safety and led to more funding for law enforcement. Others point to grassroots efforts to address homelessness and help people struggling with addiction as signs of a more community-based response.
So even if it's hard to measure the direct impact, it seems like this case had a pretty big cultural impact.
Yeah.
It got people thinking and talking about some really complicated and important issues.
It definitely did. It forced people to face some uncomfortable truths about their city and the systems in place. And while there may not be easy solutions, starting those difficult conversations is a crucial step towards making progress.
It's a reminder that even the most tragic situations can sometimes be catalysts for change, making us reevaluate our values, our communities, the way we think about justice and safety. But before we get too deep into those bigger societal questions, let's come back to the trial itself. We've gone over the evidence and the arguments and how it all played into the bigger picture in San Francisco. But I keep coming back to what this whole thing might say about the tech world specifically. Both Lee and Momeni were part of that community, right? And it feels like their stories are really tied up in the unique pressures and the whole vibe of that world.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you think about it. There's this image of the tech industry as being all about innovation and disrupting things and these crazy levels of success. But then underneath that, there's this intense pressure, this constant competition, risk-taking, always pushing the limits.
Almost like a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
And we know that both Lee and Momeni were engaging in risky behavior, especially with drugs. Do you think that's something specific to tech culture, or is it more just a reflection of a certain type of person?
That's a good question. I mean, there's definitely a culture of pushing boundaries in certain parts of the tech world, and that can definitely spill over into people's personal lives too. But I don't think it's just a tech thing. I mean, any high-pressure, high-stakes environment can create that kind of intensity, and that can lead people to make risky choices in their personal lives.
So it's not that tech is inherently more prone to these issues, but maybe it kind of amplifies them or creates an environment where those behaviors are more accepted.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And that idea of certain things being more accepted is worth thinking about. Especially in Silicon Valley, there's often this feeling that the rules are different for people who are disrupting industries or making a ton of money. It's like they feel invincible, like the consequences that apply to everyone else don't apply to them.
Which can be a dangerous way of thinking, as this whole case shows.
For sure. It reminds us that no matter how smart or successful you are, you're not above the law or human nature.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering, what can we as individuals actually learn from this case? I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the sensational parts of it, but are there any takeaways that we can apply to our own lives, even if we're not in tech?
I think so. I mean, first of all, it reminds us that even in a world that's so dominated by technology and online interactions, real-life relationships still really matter. They can be sources of amazing support and happiness. But as we've seen, they can also lead to conflict and tragedy. It's so important to pay attention to those relationships and to address problems before they spiral out of control.
Yeah, like a reminder to make those real-life connections a priority, even when the world feels so virtual. What else?
I think self-awareness is huge.
Yeah.
Both Lee and Momeni were involved in things that carried a lot of risk, whether it was drugs or getting into confrontations that could easily escalate. It reminds us that we all have blind spots, and we need to be honest with ourselves about our own weaknesses and tendencies.
Basically taking responsibility for our choices, even when they have consequences we didn't intend. That actually makes me think of another important takeaway: the importance of critical thinking and being smart about the media we consume. This case was all over the news and everyone had an opinion, but a lot of those opinions were based on speculation or incomplete information. It shows how important it is to question what we read and hear, to look for different perspectives and form our own conclusions.
Absolutely. We can't just passively absorb information, especially now, when it's so easy to get caught up in these sensationalized stories, or to only hear from people who agree with us. This case is a perfect example of how a complicated story can get boiled down to these simple headlines or used to push certain agendas. It's up to each of us to look deeper, to question what we're being told, and to come to our own informed opinions.
So to everyone listening, as you go about your day, we want you to think about this. What are your blind spots? How can you be more aware of yourself and make choices that reflect your values? And in a world that's just overflowing with information, how can you be a more critical and thoughtful consumer of news and media? These are questions worth asking ourselves as we try to navigate this crazy modern world.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it. We've covered so much today, from the details of the trial to the bigger picture of society and culture. I hope this deep dive has given you a new way of looking at this fascinating and ultimately tragic case.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back next time with another in-depth look at something that'll get you thinking.